Ni hao ma, let's look at a couple of original Chinese Dao. Ni hao ma, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So over the years we've looked at various types of Chinese sword and Chinese other weapons. In fact, they're very, very interesting. Obviously a long history there, many different types of swords. And thankfully, largely thanks actually to LK Chen for sending me examples. We've had a lot of LK Chen swords over the years. This is the Niuwei Dao. I think this has been updated now since this version. This is an earlier version. But this is essentially modelled on a Qing 19th century period, really kind of end of the 19th century and even into the early 20th century. So kind of from a European perspective, or should we say Western perspective, kind of Boxer rebellion period. These were around going back into the middle of the 19th century. But this kind of, I would consider, relatively exaggerated shape really seems to become more common, more prevalent, more produced towards the end of the 19th century, as far as I've seen, okay? So this is based really on a late 19th century and even into the early 20th century style of sabre, Chinese sabre as you'll sometimes see them referred, really correctly referred to as a Dao. A Dao is essentially any single-edged sword, and I believe that Dao is also used for knife in Chinese. So this is in contrast to the Jian, which we looked at in a recent video. So the Jian is a straight double-edged sword. Now the Jian was still sometimes used as a military sword, even in the 19th century, but generally speaking, Dao or single-edged swords, really from the late Ming dynasty onwards, the Dao really took over as the military sword, and the straight Jian, straight double-edged sword, was seen as the sort of gentleman's kind of dress sword, status sword, and even dueling sword, whereas this was seen as the military sword. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, China had various wars with various people in the 19th century and was using these swords, and they were still using swords into the 20th century. They were still issuing swords even in the Second World War for use against the Japanese invaders. So these sorts of swords, although they were essentially this type, the Niuwei Dao is a more or less 19th century design, at least in the form you see here, they were still being made and issued in the 20th century. So I'm going to put this new one, the Niuwei Dao, down for a second. I might come back to it in a second. And we're going to look at a couple of originals. So here, essentially, is a real antique Niuwei Dao. So this is a real old one that has come to me. Now you'll notice that it's a very similar shape to what you've just seen of the LK Chen. One thing I have to note is this is a little bit heavier, a little bit more blade heavy, a little bit less nimble, and it has a completely thick and really quite unflexible blade. Okay, so something we often see, particularly with the sort of kung fu versions, and I'll do this gingerly, not to say that the LK Chen is actually it's modelled on a historical original, but they tend to be very thin. Now, it's not to say that isn't historical. In fact, I've had an 18th century Qing Dao, which was very flexible, and very often we'll talk about quality in a second, but very often we find the earlier ones are quite flexible. But by the time we get into the 19th century, particularly the end of the 19th century and into the sort of Boxer rebellion period, they were churning out these swords for issuing to the sort of mass recruited troops. So these were mass produced in their time. And they're not the best quality, in all honesty. This is actually quite a nice one, and I've had a few over the years. I've even done a video actually about one of them, and some of those have been horribly made. This is actually okay. This is probably also a civilian one, is my guess, because of the brass fittings. The Boxer Rebellion era ones, military ones, seem to have iron fittings, although you might disagree with that, so by all means post down below if you know more about that. But what I really wanted to say is these, shall we say, 19th century kind of sort of mass-produced ones, they are absolutely intended as weapons, and they've got a decent edge on them, but they are much more clunky and heavy, and they really handle more like a European falchion and even the heavier varieties of falchion. So these are big, old, beefy swords, and a lot of the movements you see in Chinese martial arts are designed for moving quite weighty blades around, and might look quite exaggerated from a sort of Western fencing perspective, but when you have a weapon like this in your hand, it really does move more like a sort of Viking era sword or a falchion or a fairly heavy arming sword. That's what they're really comparable with. Now, the second sword I'm going to look at here is a Dadao, and this is a pretty cool thing actually. It's got some nice detailing around the guard section there. I believe that that particular style of wrapping might be associated with the Boxer Rebellion as well. And it's got a really interesting cross section to the grip that's quite rectangular. It's more like a messer. And in fact, it's quite like a European messer in many, many ways. I mean, it doesn't have the nagel, but that's about it. In every other way, it's got a similar size, it's got a similar length hilt. The big noticeable difference, of course, is the ring pommel, which really is a typical Chinese feature which goes back 2,000 years, probably 2,500 years, into the Han Dynasty. And this is a feature which we still see being made on Dadao, being manufactured and issued in the Second World War, in the 1930s and 40s. Absolutely incredible. But this is probably an example, I believe, from the 19th century. I need to do a bit more research on these. It could be early 20th century, but I think it's 19th century. So I think, and these came from the same source, I think that these are probably contemporary, and they were probably brought back by a British soldier or adventurer or traveller, probably at the end of the 19th century or in the beginning of the 20th century. So really interesting examples. And the only thing I really wanted to add, funnily enough, you might think the Dadao is, because they've got a reputation for being big old cleavers, is more unwieldy than the Niuwei Dao. In fact, the Dadao here is actually somewhat more wieldable, largely because of where the point of balance is, because you've got that longer hilt. But an interesting detail is that little guard there conflicts with my knuckles a bit, so it's a little bit uncomfortable to hold. So I'm actually holding it further down than I normally would do. But anyway, what I really wanted to say was these 19th century Chinese swords are often relatively mass produced and really quite blade heavy by comparison with most other swords from most other periods. They are great big choppers, and they are very, very choppy and are not as nimble as LK Chen's Niuweidao. However, there are examples, there are antique examples which are more like this out there, and as I say, this was a model antique example. And if you go back to the 17th and 18th century Qing examples, then indeed they tend to have thinner and lighter blades like this. Anyway, I hope that's been somewhat interesting. Not a very in-depth video, I know, but it's really cool to get my hands on two original, at least relatively old, antique Chinese Qing dynasty Dao, Niuweidao, Dadao. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will of course be again next time. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.